In this episode, we are moving into a part of security work that can sound abstract at first, but becomes extremely important once a vulnerability program starts producing more findings than anyone can keep track of in their head. Metrics and Key Performance Indicators, KPIs, in vulnerability management are how organizations measure whether their efforts are actually improving security or simply creating more reports, more tickets, and more noise. For a brand new learner, the key idea is that security teams need more than a list of weaknesses. They also need ways to understand trends, speed, backlog, accountability, and whether the organization is getting better at reducing exposure over time. That is where metrics and KPIs come in. They help translate raw vulnerability activity into information that people can act on. Without them, a program may feel busy, but it becomes hard to tell whether the most important issues are being handled well, whether the environment is improving, or whether the same problems are quietly piling up behind the scenes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A metric is simply a measurement, while a KPI is a measurement chosen because it says something especially important about performance against a goal. That distinction matters because beginners often treat the two terms as if they mean exactly the same thing. In practice, a vulnerability management program can collect many metrics, but only some of those metrics will truly function as KPIs. For example, the total number of findings in the environment is a metric because it measures something real. However, whether that number is a true KPI depends on the goals of the program and how useful the number is for decision-making. A KPI usually reflects something that leadership or managers care about in a meaningful way, such as how quickly critical vulnerabilities are remediated, how many issues are overdue, or whether the organization is meeting its expected remediation timelines. The point is not to gather numbers for their own sake. The point is to choose measurements that reveal whether the program is actually reducing risk and improving operational performance. One of the biggest reasons metrics matter is that vulnerability management is a continuous process, not a one-time cleanup project. New weaknesses appear all the time through software updates, system changes, newly discovered flaws, configuration drift, business growth, and shifting technology environments. That means an organization cannot judge itself fairly by looking at one week or one scan in isolation. It needs measurements that show direction over time. If the number of critical findings is falling, that may suggest improvement. If the average age of open vulnerabilities keeps increasing, that may suggest a growing backlog and weakening follow-through. If a certain department repeatedly misses remediation targets, that may reveal a process issue, a staffing problem, or weak accountability. Metrics give shape to those patterns. They make it possible to see movement rather than just snapshots. In vulnerability management, that is essential because risk often grows quietly. A well-chosen set of measurements helps teams notice whether they are gaining control, standing still, or gradually losing ground despite appearing active on the surface. A very common starting point is volume, because organizations want to know how many vulnerabilities they have discovered and how those findings are distributed. Counting total vulnerabilities can be useful, especially when broken down by severity, business unit, asset type, or system criticality. Still, volume alone can be misleading. A high number of findings does not automatically mean a program is failing, and a lower number does not automatically mean the environment is safe. One organization may discover more vulnerabilities simply because it has broader visibility, better scanning coverage, and more complete asset awareness. Another may report fewer findings because important systems are not being assessed properly. That is why counts should be interpreted carefully. A number becomes useful when placed in context. Knowing how many vulnerabilities exist matters, but it matters more when paired with information about where those findings are concentrated, whether they are increasing or decreasing, and how much of that population represents real, actionable exposure that should concern the organization. Severity distribution is another important measurement because not all vulnerabilities deserve the same level of urgency. A vulnerability management program usually needs to know how many low, medium, high, and critical findings are open at a given time. But that view becomes much more useful when it is connected to real business context. A large number of low-severity items may be worth tracking, but a smaller cluster of critical issues on internet-facing or mission-critical assets may deserve much more attention. Metrics that separate vulnerabilities by seriousness help teams focus effort where it matters most. Even so, severity should not be treated as the only lens that matters. A medium-severity issue on a sensitive identity platform may deserve faster action than a higher-rated issue on a less exposed or less valuable system. Good programs understand that severity metrics are starting points, not final answers. They help reveal where exposure is concentrated, but they must be interpreted alongside asset importance, exploitability, and operational impact if leaders are going to make sensible decisions. Age is one of the most revealing vulnerability management metrics because it shows how long-known weaknesses have remained unresolved. A newly discovered issue and a 6-month-old issue may have the same technical severity, but their operational meaning is very different. Older vulnerabilities suggest delayed remediation, weak ownership, inadequate prioritization, or persistent inhibitors that keep the organization from closing known risk. Tracking age helps identify whether the backlog is becoming more dangerous over time. It also helps distinguish between an environment that has many findings because it recently expanded visibility and an environment that has many findings because it is failing to act on known problems. Aging data becomes especially useful when broken into categories such as how many findings are open beyond 30, 60, or 90 days, or how many critical items have exceeded their expected remediation windows. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest examples of how a measurement can tell a story. The age of vulnerabilities does not just show what exists. It shows whether the organization is actually keeping pace with the risk it already knows about. Another core measurement is remediation speed, often expressed as mean time to remediate, MTTR. This metric tracks how long it takes, on average, to resolve vulnerabilities after they are identified. MTTR is attractive because it seems to answer a practical question very directly. It tells the organization whether it is moving quickly or slowly from discovery to action. However, like most metrics, it can be useful or misleading depending on how it is interpreted. A single average may hide important differences between critical and low-severity issues, between public-facing and internal systems, or between business units with very different responsibilities. A team may even improve its average by quickly closing easy, low-risk findings while difficult, high-risk issues remain open. That does not make MTTR useless, but it does mean the number needs context. Good vulnerability programs often look at remediation speed by severity, by asset type, or by ownership group so they can see where delays are actually happening and whether the speed reflects meaningful risk reduction rather than statistical comfort. Overdue remediation is closely related to age and MTTR, but it deserves attention on its own because it ties performance to stated expectations. Most organizations define target windows for remediation based on the seriousness of the vulnerability and the criticality of the affected asset. These targets may be driven by policy, risk tolerance, contractual commitments, or internal operating discipline. A metric that tracks how many findings are overdue shows whether the program is living up to those expectations. This matters because a vulnerability management process should not only measure activity, it should also measure accountability. If teams regularly miss remediation deadlines, leadership needs to know whether the problem is isolated, widespread, temporary, or chronic. The overdue population can also help identify where inhibitors are strongest. A recurring set of late findings in one area may point to weak staffing, difficult legacy systems, poor ownership clarity, or unrealistic timelines. For a new learner, overdue metrics are a useful reminder that vulnerability management is not just about knowing what risk exists. It is about knowing whether the organization is responding within the boundaries it has defined for itself. Coverage metrics are also important, even though they receive less attention than backlog and remediation speed. A program cannot manage vulnerabilities well if it does not know whether it is actually looking at the right systems. Coverage measurements help answer questions such as how much of the asset population is being assessed, whether critical systems are included, whether scans or reviews are occurring with the expected frequency, and whether the organization has blind spots where vulnerabilities may exist without visibility. This is important because low findings can sometimes reflect low visibility rather than low risk. A mature program does not celebrate small numbers automatically. It first asks whether the environment is being measured broadly and consistently enough for those numbers to mean anything. Coverage metrics also support honest reporting because they tell leadership where the vulnerability picture is strong and where it may still be incomplete. For beginners, this is a vital concept. A vulnerability metric only has value if the underlying visibility is good enough for the metric to represent reality rather than a narrow, comforting slice of it. Not every useful metric is technical in nature. Some of the most valuable measurements are process-based because they show whether the organization is handling vulnerability management with discipline. For example, a team may track how quickly findings are assigned to owners, how often exceptions are reviewed, how many remediation plans are missing status updates, or how many findings are reopened after being marked resolved. These kinds of measurements reveal whether the process around remediation is healthy, not just whether the technical environment contains weaknesses. That matters because poor process usually turns into poor security results over time. A finding that sits unassigned for weeks is not merely an administrative issue. It reflects delayed accountability. A vulnerability that is repeatedly marked fixed and then rediscovered may signal weak validation or incomplete remediation. Process metrics help expose those patterns before they grow into large operational failures. New learners should understand that vulnerability management is partly a technology problem, but it is also a workflow problem, and good metrics should make both sides visible. At the same time, organizations must be careful not to choose metrics that create the wrong behavior. This is one of the most important lessons in the whole topic. People respond to what gets measured, and if a metric is poorly chosen, teams may optimize for the number instead of the real goal. For example, if a program focuses too heavily on closing as many findings as possible, teams may rush to close easy issues while delaying harder but more important ones. If leadership demands a low vulnerability count without understanding coverage, teams may be tempted to limit scope rather than improve security. If average remediation time becomes the main measure of success, staff may game the process in ways that make the statistics look good while meaningful risk remains. Good KPI design therefore requires judgment. A useful KPI should encourage the behaviors the organization actually wants, such as timely remediation of meaningful risk, honest reporting, consistent follow-through, and improved security posture over time. Metrics are powerful, but they can push a program in the wrong direction if they are not chosen thoughtfully. Audience matters here just as much as it matters in other kinds of security reporting. The same vulnerability data may need to be presented very differently depending on who is looking at it. Technical teams often need detail, such as backlog by system, overdue findings by owner, and remediation time for different severity levels. Managers may need to see team performance, recurring bottlenecks, and whether service expectations are being met. Executives usually need a smaller set of KPIs that show overall exposure, trend direction, and where the organization is improving or struggling. If every audience receives the same raw numbers in the same format, the message often gets lost. A dashboard built for analysts may overwhelm a senior leader, while an executive summary may be too vague for the people expected to fix the issue. Strong vulnerability reporting uses metrics that fit the audience without changing the underlying truth. For a beginner, that means learning that measurement alone is not enough. The measurement must be communicated in a way that helps each audience understand the problem and decide what to do next. Context is what turns a metric into insight. A number by itself rarely tells the full story, even if the number is accurate. Suppose a report says the organization has 2,000 open vulnerabilities. That might sound terrible, but the real meaning depends on asset count, severity mix, coverage maturity, trend direction, and the proportion of those findings that affect critical systems. Suppose another report says average remediation time is 20 days. That may sound acceptable until someone realizes most of the quick closures were low-risk issues, while critical internet-facing vulnerabilities stayed open much longer. Good analysts avoid presenting numbers as if they explain themselves. They connect the number to scope, business importance, exposure, and change over time. This is especially important when security leaders use metrics to brief non-technical stakeholders. Executives do not just need counts. They need meaning. They need to know whether the numbers indicate growing control, rising risk, weak accountability, insufficient coverage, or some combination of those realities. Metrics gain power when they are interpreted honestly rather than displayed passively. A simple example can make this topic feel more concrete. Imagine two business units in the same organization. Unit A has many discovered vulnerabilities, but most are low severity. Remediation is steady. Overdue critical items are rare, and coverage is broad across important systems. Unit B has fewer total findings, but several critical internet-facing issues have remained open past expected deadlines. Ownership is inconsistent, and some high-value assets are not being assessed regularly. A shallow reading of the data might suggest Unit A is in worse shape because its total number is higher. A more thoughtful use of metrics and KPIs would show that Unit B may present the more serious risk picture despite having fewer findings overall. This is why metric selection and interpretation matter so much. Good vulnerability management does not reward whatever number looks smallest. It asks what the numbers reveal about true exposure, operational discipline, and the organization's ability to reduce meaningful risk over time. That deeper reading is what separates mature measurement from superficial reporting. By the end of this discussion, the most important takeaway is that metrics and KPIs help vulnerability management move from activity to understanding. They show whether findings are accumulating or shrinking, whether critical issues are aging, whether remediation is timely, whether coverage is sufficient, and whether the overall program is functioning with the discipline it claims to have. They also help different audiences see the security picture at the right level, from technical backlog details to leadership-level indicators of trend and accountability. For a new CySA Plus learner, the goal is not to memorize a single perfect list of measurements. The goal is to understand what a good measurement should do. It should reveal something meaningful about performance, support better decisions, and encourage behavior that reduces real risk rather than merely improving the appearance of the numbers. When metrics and KPIs are chosen wisely and interpreted with context, they become one of the most valuable tools in vulnerability management because they make progress, weakness, and accountability visible in a way that people across the organization can understand.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.